Hi, everyone, and thank you for coming today, especially the New Zealand folk. I know it's super early for you guys. So today I am presenting some results from a project that I've been working on with team member Laura Spake. In this paper, we examine changes in maternal social support networks and in the patterns of childcare help women received during the COVID-19 pandemic in the USA and the UK. So I'll start with a bit of background on why we thought this research was important. The COVID-19 pandemic and associated government-imposed restrictions have severely impacted mothers by changing their support networks. And this has even been referred to as a gendered pandemic by researchers, especially PETs and colleagues. Due to the social distancing measures enacted by governments and the closures of schools and daycare centers, parents have lost important sources of paid as well as unpaid support for childcare and household tasks. As a result, both partners, like mothers and their partners, have increased the number of hours they spend on childcare since the onset of the pandemic. However, the increase in unpaid work has not been distributed evenly across both partners. Recent work suggests that the increased amount of both childcare and housework has largely been borne by women, such that gender gaps in unpaid work have not been sizably reduced during the pandemic. Okay, so for example, in this figure here, this shows findings by Farre et al. In Spain that men increased their participation in housework and childcare slightly, but most of the burden fell on women who were already doing most of the housework before the pandemic, which you can see in these bottom rows here. So this difficulty in balancing increased childcare responsibilities has also impacted women economically. Women are more likely than men to have either reduced their paid workload or lost employment during the pandemic. And when they have kept employment, they have been more likely to report shifting their work hours to evenings and weekends. For example, in Germany, Zock and colleagues find that during the first months of the COVID-19 pandemic, mothers continued to serve as main caregivers, whereas fathers and relatives remained in a supporting role, which can be seen in this figure. The 30% block in both columns shows the percentage of care provided by mothers only. A study in the US in April 2020 by PETs and colleagues also found that for parents with young children, losing full-time childcare was associated with an increased risk of unemployment for mothers, but not for fathers. And for parents with school-aged children, participation in homeschooling had adverse employment outcomes for mothers, but not fathers. So while we are beginning to understand how the pandemic is impacting families, studies on the impact of this pandemic on childcare have largely focused on how increased responsibility of care has been shared between partners. However, the traditional family is not a nuclear one, even in Western high-income settings. We know from studies in evolutionary anthropology that human mothers have limits to their energy and time, and unlike other primates, often care for multiple dependent children simultaneously. Mothers thus face certain trade-offs, for example, caring for a newborn while also provisioning for older offsprings. And in these situations, allo mothers, or carers other than mothers, help diminish these energy and time trade-offs by supporting mothers and caring for or investing in their children's survival and success. Allo-maternal care is therefore often witnessed cross-culturally, including in hunter-gatherer and agricultural societies, as can be seen in this graph by Kramer and Vale, and also in high-income and industrialized settings. For example, in the UK, family members, particularly maternal grandmothers, have been identified as important sources of childcare and domestic help by Emmett and colleagues. And recent work in the US and UK, using the data that we have used for this study, has also found that mothers receive childcare help from multiple people, although this was variable by the mother's partnership status. Studies focusing on a nuclear family then ignore the major contributions of wider social support networks, who provide significant childcare and emotional support to mothers. This loss of allo care during the pandemic may also be especially pronounced in the UK, where three-generation households, that is containing grandparents, adult children, or adult parents and young children. And these three-generation households are rare in the UK, limiting in-person contact between mothers and their own parents, who are usually key caregivers. So to fully understand the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on mothers and children, research must consider how the pandemic and associated restrictions have impacted relationships with individuals within, but also beyond the nuclear family. Unsurprisingly, the pandemic has also deeply affected maternal mental well-being. Several studies have now shown that maternal depression and parental burnout have increased during the pandemic. Amongst concerns cited by mothers are pandemic-related financial stress, lack of support and connection, particularly to family members besides their partners, and inadequate support with their own health. Recent research on maternal well-being during the COVID-19 pandemic has also emphasized that lockdown measures may be extremely disadvantageous for families with children, especially mothers with young infants. This quote here, taken from Myers and Emmett 2021, describes one woman's experience of motherhood during the pandemic. And she says, "I think lockdown has made me feel like I'm not a person in my own right anymore, just a mom." And she ends with, "I feel like I don't have any time to rest." However, in contrast to this, on a slightly more positive note, mothers in the UK, also in this study by Myers and Emmett, have also recognized the well-being benefit of the pandemic. They note that lockdown measures have meant that mothers, fathers, and older children spend more time at home, especially with new babies, and this has facilitated family bonding. So in this paper, we first examine and describe changes in mothers' physical and emotional support networks during the COVID-19 pandemic, as well as changes in their perceived need for and actual receipt of childcare and household help. We then explore 3 research questions. First, were changes in mothers' perceived need for help during the pandemic associated with changes in actual receipt of help? Secondly, since mothers appear to have shouldered the burden of additional childcare and to have been more likely to reduce their work hours during the pandemic, is there a correlation between reduction in women's participation in paid work and their reduction in receipt of allomaternal support as well as paid support? And finally, is there an association between self-reported maternal mental health and pandemic-related changes in the support received by mothers, their perceived need for help, their paid workload, and the frequency of their contact with their emotional support network? The data used for this study come from an online survey of mothers conducted in August 2020 during the COVID-19 pandemic. Women residing in either the UK or the US were eligible for the survey if they had at least one child under the age of 5 years, I think, who co-resided with them. The final sample size for this study was 1,528 women, of which 609 were in the US and 919 were in the UK. Participants were recruited through Prolific, an online platform which connects researchers with participants. Women were compensated £1.25, which was roughly, I think, $1.60 or something for completing the questionnaire. Respondents answered questions about their own demographic and socioeconomic characteristics, the size and form of their social networks, about who helped provide childcare to one focal child under the age of 5 years, the number of hours weekly that the child had spent in paid childcare, and their self-reported mental health. To assess the impact of the pandemic on mothers and their support networks, participants were asked about how the COVID-19 pandemic had affected their ability to work, their levels of contact with their social network, and their ability to obtain care for their children as well as their households. Helpers were defined as anyone providing childcare help, including the child's biological father and or the mother's current partner, but excluded any paid or state-provided help, such as nannies, daycares, or care aides. Our outcome variables for this paper included change in women's need for childcare or household help since the beginning of the pandemic, change in receipt of childcare or household help, so with childcare and household help measured separately, change in accessing paid help for children, and change in performance of paid work, as well as their self-reported maternal mental health. The survey also had a social network component, which asked mothers to list close members of their social network, and further questions measured change in the frequency of their contact with the self-reported social network, both virtually as well as in person. All of these variables that measured change, so all of them apart from the self-reported maternal mental health, were assessed by the mother as her current experience relative to before the start of the pandemic, and reported by the mother as either less often, about the same, or more often than before the pandemic. For modeling purposes, we transformed each of these variables into two binary variables, the first indicating whether the mother reported about the same or less or more often, and the second indicating whether the mother reported about the same or less often. For each of these new variables, mothers reporting the third category of answer were assigned NA values. Self-reported maternal mental health was assessed by asking mothers to report their mental health on a scale, selecting one of four categories: fit and well, mostly well, often unwell, and mostly feel unwell. But due to the small number of mostly feel unwell, I think, responses, this variable was collapsed into two, so mostly well and mostly unwell. We first used ANOVA's and chi-square tests to describe our sample, and then built multivariate regression models to explore our research questions. Directed acyclic or acyclic graphs or DAGs were used to determine the inclusion of covariates in models. Models were created separately for the US and the UK, as we expected that the experience of the pandemic may have been different between the two countries as they experienced different restrictions. So this DAG on the screen here, it shows the relationships between all covariates for the regression model, testing associations between change in allocare received and maternal mental health. So that was one of the models that we ran. And this is the original output from the package DAGity, developed by Richard McElraith, which we used to create the DAGs. So in this figure, you can see, so this circle here represents maternal mental health. I don't know this, I'll explain it in case you're not familiar with DAGs. So that's our outcome variable here. And then at the bottom is allocare, change in allocare received. And this arrow here points to maternal mental health. And we basically provided these arrows or these directions, indicating that we expect allocare to impact maternal mental health. And then we included all these other variables that you see here into the list, and also provided the directions that we expected that having a partner or not having a partner would impact the need of the woman. And I will explain this more now. So for each DAG, we first, as I was saying, we first wrote a list of all potential covariates, which we expected would be correlated with our primary exposure and our main outcome variable. We then set the primary exposure and outcome variables for each of the DAGs, so an individual DAG for each model that we ran, and entered the list of pre-considered covariates. And this generated a list of implied conditional independencies. These are basically the package's assumptions about relationships between certain variables, based on the information that we have entered. It picks up on any relationship between the entered variables that we have not specified and asks us to confirm if these variables are indeed independent of each other. We can then check these relationships using the data. So each of these implied conditional independencies are then tested using either regressions or t-tests or any other, whatever appropriate test that we used. And we check if they're actually independent from each other in the data. And then the DAG is updated until all of these implied independencies are met. So this process of obtaining the list of covariates, checking implied conditional independencies, and updating the DAG was repeated until all of these implied conditional independencies were met. And then finally, when we're satisfied with the independencies that the DAG is, or the package sends back to us, we can obtain the final list of covariates that I think should be included for that model. And in this case, sometimes it gives you two different options, and if that happened, we used the smaller one, the one that had fewer variables. So this DAG is a formatted version of the one shown on the previous slide, thanks to Laura. And this here shows the outcome variable, maternal mental health, in blue, and then allocare received up here. And and all of the variables that we entered. But now you can see some are in white and some are in gray, and the gray ones are the ones that the DAG decided that we did not need to include. So it's all the directions of effect here are the same as before. It's just rearranged the order, and all the ones that are closer to the outcome and exposure are included, and the ones that are not included are the ones that are already being taken account of through one of the ones in the middle. Sorry, that was a brief aside on DAGs. So going into results. We first described changes during the pandemic in support needed and received by mothers, as well as their participation in paid work. This figure depicts the percentage of mothers who experienced a change in their need for childcare or household help and their ability to perform paid work or receipt of allocare or household help during the pandemic. Roughly a quarter of mothers surveyed in both the US and the UK reported that they needed childcare and household help more often during the pandemic than they had previously, which is indicated in this figure in yellow, so at the top. However, a smaller percentage of women in both countries received more allocare and household help during the pandemic. In fact, about 40%, I think, of women in the US and 50% in the UK reported that they received less allocare during the pandemic, which is shown in purple. And in the center, the green is the women who reported receiving the same amount of help. 30% of women in the US and about 40% in the UK reported performing less paid work during the pandemic as opposed to before it, while a small proportion of the sample reported performing more paid work during the pandemic. We then explored sociodemographic characteristics of mothers that correlated with receiving either more or less support relative to mothers who experienced no change. In the US, women who received less help during the pandemic compared to mothers who experienced no change in their childcare support tended to be wealthier, better educated, and experienced more change in their employment, primarily reducing their work hours. So about 52% versus 23% of women who experienced no change in childcare support. US mothers who received more help also tended to be wealthier, more educated, and were also more likely to have experienced a change in paid work. However, these changes were slightly split between women who decreased their paid work, so about 40%, and those who increased it, about 20%. Compared to women who experienced no change in childcare help in the UK, those who received less help were more likely to be born in the UK, had higher education, had more children in their household, and were more likely to have experienced a higher rate of reduction of paid work, similar to the US. So here it was 40% versus 18%. 18% of women who experienced no change or so reported receiving the same help during the pandemic. Those who received more help in the UK also tended to be more educated, had fewer children at home, and were more likely to have experienced a change in paid work. As in the US, these changes were more evenly split between women who decreased paid work and those who increased it. Other sociodemographic traits did not meaningfully vary between women who experienced no change in help received and those who did experience a change. We then explored how different types of helpers and social network members changed either their level of support or their level of contact with the woman during the pandemic. This figure here shows the percentage of helpers providing more, less, or about the same amount of allocare relative to their contribution prior to the pandemic by their relationship to the child. It makes a very neat picture here. So children's fathers and mothers' partners either maintained or increased their childcare contributions. Broadly, the same was true for siblings, but up to 26% of siblings in the US actually contributed less allomothering than they had before the pandemic. So this one here, which is very different to the UK. Older kin in the UK, which included grandparents and great-grandparents, mostly reduced childcare, which is this percentage here. I think this was about 70%. But the same was not true in the US, where only 40% of older kin reduced level of allomothering. Sorry, that's the UK, that's the 70% and the 40%. Other kin, for example, aunts, parents, and cousins, and as well as non-kin also largely reduced their allomaternal contributions. So as you can see in this figure, this nuclearization of networks, which is more support coming from the immediate family, so fathers and mothers' partners and siblings, which is increased here, and then decreased, these big purple columns from everyone else, is much stronger in the UK than it is in the US. So as expected, mothers generally reduce their level of in-person contact with all members of their social network, not including their partners. They saw about half of their social network connections in person less often during the pandemic than they had before it. However, mothers did increase the frequency with which they contacted their social network virtually, for example, through phone calls, texts, social media messages, etc. This figure here shows the percentage of social network members contacted virtually more often, less often, or about the same during the pandemic as compared to before it. And this is now by the relationship of the social network member to the mother. So women increased their social their contact most with their mothers and mothers-in-law, which you can see here, as well as their sisters, while non-kin and other kin were contacted more often at somewhat lower rates. The patterns were stronger in the UK than they were in the US, where about 40% increased virtual contact with mothers and mothers-in-law compared to 50% in the UK. So in this figure, we illustrate results from the regression analysis for our first research question, which shows odds ratios as dots and the whiskers as 95% confidence intervals for the relationship between changes in the need for an actual receipt of support during the pandemic. There was a strong association between needing more help with both childcare and household tasks and receiving more help, which you can see here. Over here, we're showing the odds ratios for childcare help, but we've also run these models for household help, and they're very similar. So you can see the association between needing more help and receiving more help, as well as needing less help and receiving less help. And this was similar for both countries. Exploring this a little bit further, we found that women who received less help with both childcare and household tasks also had higher odds of needing more help. So receiving less help predicted needing more, and then similarly, receiving more help predicted needing less. So while these changes in need and receipt are associated, it is difficult to disentangle which one is driving the other, especially considering this is cross-sectional data. And it was perhaps likely a mix of the two that was actually going on. However, this exercise with looking at the association between need and receipt, we thought it would be informative to explore who these women were who needed more help but were receiving less help during the pandemic, as they may be particularly vulnerable. So in the US, these women were slightly older, more educated, more likely to have experienced a change in paid work due to the pandemic, and also relied on a greater number of unpaid helpers before the pandemic. In the UK, these women were more educated, tended to identify with as having poorer mental health. And similarly, prior to the onset of the pandemic, they tended to rely on a greater number of unpaid childcare helpers, as well as more hours of paid childcare. Moving on to our second research question, we explored whether women's reduction of participating in their own paid work was correlated with reductions in receiving less unpaid and paid childcare, so less allocare and less paid help. So here we show the odds ratios and 95% confidence intervals for the effect of a reduction in unpaid childcare, which is here on the left, and a reduction in paid childcare on the performance of paid work. So women who received less allocare during the pandemic had higher odds of reducing their paid work compared to women who received the same amount of support in both countries. And similarly, in both countries, women who accessed paid childcare help less during the pandemic had higher odds of participating less often in paid work during the pandemic compared to women who accessed the same amount of paid help. Finally, we explored associations between women's mental health and receiving childcare help, needing childcare help, performing paid work, and their virtual contact with social network. Here, odds ratios show effects of each of these changes on women reporting poorer mental health. We found no evidence of an association between receiving either less or more childcare help, so these first two here, and women's mental health in either the US or the UK, or between women needing less childcare help and their mental health in either country. Needing more childcare help during the pandemic increased odds of poorer mental health in the US, however. So you can see it here. The effects was similar for the UK, but 95% confidence intervals crossed one. So it wasn't significant. In both countries, there was no evidence of an association between women's mental health and change in participation in paid work, change in virtual contact with their social network, or a decrease in in-person contact with social network. However, in the US, so in the US, there was also no association between an increase in in-person contact and poorer maternal mental health. But in the UK, women who reported an increased in-person contact with their social network also reported poorer mental health. So to summarize some of the key findings so far, so compared to women who reported an increased need for allocare and household help during the pandemic, a smaller percentage of women in both countries reported receiving more help. So there's this gap between receipt and need. And women's wealth, education, their paid work, and the number of children in their household all correlated with change in help received. But this was some of these were correlated with both receiving more and less help. Fathers, mothers, current partners, and siblings increased their level of allocare, while older kin, other kin, and non-kin all decreased their contributions during the pandemic. As expected, in-person contact broadly decreased. In-person contact with close social network broadly decreased, while virtual contact increased. Interestingly, mothers relying on more help before the pandemic had more unmet need during the pandemic. So unmet need for help. Then in response to our second research question, receiving less paid and unpaid childcare help is associated with women reducing their own participation in paid work, or women participating less in paid work. And then lastly, for our third research question, we found that women in the US who reported a need for more help during the pandemic had a higher odds of also reporting worse mental health, whereas women in the UK who had more in-person contact with their close social network had higher odds of reporting worse mental health. So what do we make of these findings? Mothers appear to be reducing their own participation in, I'm just going to go over the two research questions first. So mothers appear to be reducing their own participation in paid work in response to reductions in paid and unpaid childcare. And this finding is consistent with other literature, which shows that women performed more household labor during the pandemic, including childcare, and then adjusted their work life around these changes. This raises potentially serious considerations about long-term impacts on women's career trajectories, their financial well-being, as well as worsening gender equality in paid work. One thing to note here is that women who had reduced paid work could potentially have been on furlough in the UK because there was a large furlough scheme implemented by the government. And I think this is something to look into further. And that would potentially have maybe different implications for this relationship. But anyway, another one limitation here was that we didn't measure maternal investment. So while we're looking at the relationship between whether women reduce their own paid work in response to reductions in help from others, we don't know how they changed their own investments in their children or in their household tasks during this period. However, we do think that this could potentially be proxied by their need for help. So instead of looking at their own investments, if they had greater need, then that might like help sort of proxy for, I don't know, or maybe measuring their need is more important than what they were doing. I don't know. Something to think about. And then in terms of the third research question regarding women's mental health, women in the US who reported increased need of help also reported poorer mental health, which is not surprising. And it's also likely that mothers who are reporting a greater perceived need for help are also those who are not having this need met. And women who have had greater need during the pandemic, but then this need was met, may be less likely to report it. And then our finding about increased contact with social network driving poorer mental health in the UK has actually also been documented by another study by Myers and Emmett, who attribute this to women visiting their ill relatives. But it's difficult to disentangle the direction of effect here, whether it was poorer mental health that was driving the increase in in-person contact, or vice versa. So it could be that the poor mental health was a product of having relatives who were really ill and of just generally being in the middle of a pandemic. However, it could also be that women were more willing to risk contact with their in-person or risk in-person contact with their network if they had poorer mental health. So yeah, one of the reasons that we see we don't see that many effects for this these regressions could be that our measure of mental health was really crude. It was just a very simple self-reported question, and other studies have found different results regarding mental health. Another reason that's sort of been put forward by a couple of papers is that by August, it's possible that women had begun to adjust to the lockdown and to the pandemic, and it's possible that women had much worse mental health in the beginning to start with, but then by August, they were less likely to report poor mental health. And then lastly, one of the findings from Myers and Emmett, which I mentioned earlier, about family bonding in the UK, it's I wonder if that plays some sort of role, or if that sort of support from partners and the facilitation of family bonding in the household potentially buffered against worse mental health effects. But that is me speculating. So from our descriptive results, we see that in both the US and the UK, there was an apparent nuclearization of women's support networks. Fathers, women's current partners, and siblings provided more support than they had before the pandemic, whereas all others provided less. One explanation for this is simply co-residence. Fathers, stepfathers, and siblings are all likely to co-reside with the mother and her child, and therefore be more available to them during periods of social distancing compared to the other categories of helpers. This nuclearization, however, could also be driving poorer mental health, which is potentially signaled through the unmet need of help in the US and women risking in-person contact with social networks in the UK. Regarding the socio-demographic correlates of change in support received and needed by women, this is helpful in identifying the groups of women who were in greater need of assistance, like for who were receiving less support or needed more. But I'm unsure about what these specific characteristics that we've identified signify, as they're very similar for increase and decrease in support received. So we have to explore this a little bit further. Then the women who were relying on a greater number of caregivers before the pandemic had increased need during it. And in the UK, these women also had worse mental health. So this is interesting because wider social networks can be considered as a form of risk buffering, and that relying on more individuals means that the loss of one can be absorbed more easily. However, it's also possible, so you would think that a bigger network would have been better, but it could also be possible that relying on more people pre-pandemic itself signified a greater need for help. And then during the pandemic, if you lost all of your network, it was just more detrimental. And then lastly, we see that patterns of nuclearization were stronger in the UK than in the US. This may potentially partially be explained by the higher percentage of children living in 3-generation households in the UK than they are in the US, as was mentioned in the introduction. But it is most probably a product of the variations in the government-imposed COVID-19 restrictions that were imposed in both countries. The Oxford COVID-19 Government Response Tracker, developed by Hale and colleagues recently, shows COVID-19 restriction trajectories for different countries. This shows that while patterns of restrictions appear more restrictive in the US, in reality, there was more nuance in local restrictions. For example, regarding the stay-at-home orders in the UK, everyone was told to stay at home from the 23rd of March, and this eased between mid-May and June. In the US, about 90% of states enacted stay-at-home orders by May 2020, but less than 75% of all states kept these orders in place by August 2020. It could potentially be informative to break down the US sample by states to see if the impact varied depending on different COVID-19 restrictions. Yep, and we are still fine-tuning our discussion, so I'm going to leave it at that, and all thoughts are welcome. Yeah. Okay, so thank you, everyone. Thank you to the John Templeton Foundation for funding this study, the University of Otago and LSHTM for ethics approval, and the whole evolutionary demography of religion core team who has, for all your support for the project as well as during the pandemic. And those of you who aren't part of the team, do check out our project online and follow us on Twitter. Thank you.